All right, today, guys, I'm going to be going over classification. So, just to give you some place, we left off yesterday with divergent and convergent evolution, how things can branch from a common ancestor, or how they can also um, converge. If the environment demands it, they may end up having similar characteristics without really common ancestry. So, those two things can both occur. Anyway, moving on from that. So this was an example, um, a bird in Africa and a bird in the Americas that look very much alike and really aren't closely related at all if you were to look at it in terms of their DNA. So how do we know that some of those things aren't more closely related? Well, that gets into classification, the science of taxonomy or systematics, where um, we are referring to the relatedness or lack of relatedness of organisms. So that's classification, taxonomy. That's an important term for you to know. Taxonomy. That's what we're referring to with regard to taxonomy. Okay, a couple of different ways. Well, first of all, I guess the purpose. Why is it important that we have a set way of referring to these things? Well, the critical piece of that is if if you and I are both studying the same organism, but we're not talking about it as being the same organism, it'd be quite confusing. And so it's important that all the people in biology and um, in the science of taxonomy, it's important that everyone knows what they're talking about, that we're talking about the same thing or that we're talking about something quite different. So, identifying living things, two-part scientific names. The first part is Homo, and the second part is Sapiens. So it's sort of like our names except reversed. So the first name is actually a bit more general, and the second name is more specific. For us, our first name is more specific, and our last name just puts us with our family. So anyway, that's called binomial nomenclature, which literally speaking means two name naming system. And it was developed by a guy named Carolus Linnaeus in 1673. So really, relatively new. I mean, I know we were saying that's 350 years old, so it's old. But I mean, when you think about how long people have been talking about animals and plants and all those things, this was the first that there was really a good system of conveying to one another what species we're talking about. The second purpose of it is just to classify them into groups, to give them a place. So, first of all, just to identify them. Secondly, to give some indication of what are they more closely related to. Similar species are placed in a genera, and similar genera, that's genus, are placed in a family. And so members of the same genus or genera share more characteristics and a more recent common ancestor than do members of the family. And as we go up into bigger and bigger groups, we're going to find that there's less and less commonality or a more and more distant common ancestor. So it goes from, depending on how we look at it, if we start with species, that's very exclusive, meaning only this one type of organism is in this group. Only this one type of organism is in this particular group, is in the club. And then as we go outside that, there's an overarching genus that includes that species and maybe some other species. Um, and there you'd be talking about, things like um, wolves and domesticated dogs that are in the same genus, but they're not in the same species. Um, and then we go up from there. Oh, if we start the other way, because that's the way we usually remember it, it goes domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. And so that's something that should be familiar from one of the first chapters we had this year. I know you don't probably remember it entirely, but it should at least sound familiar. So there's what those look like: domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. So let's go through those just for us. And I would have you write this next to these. So next to domain, what you need to write is, we're going to do what it is for us, for human beings. So for humans, our domain is eukarya. That means we have cells that have a nucleus, nucleated cells that make us up. So domain eukarya, EUKARYA, domain eukarya. Kingdom, what kingdom are we in? Well, we're in with other mammals and reptiles and birds and amphibians and fish and all of those kinds of things, and insects and arthropods, and all kinds of things. So that kingdom is Animalia. So just spell it animal, IA, kingdom Animalia. So we're domain eukarya, kingdom Animalia. You should be writing these next to them so you can kind of have not only the hierarchy, but also an example of that hierarchy specific to us. Phylum, we're in the phylum Chordata. And chordata means that we have a concentrated set of nervous tissue, elongated, concentrated set of nervous tissue, our spinal cord in our case, but not all chordates would have specifically something we consider a spinal cord, but that's the commonality. So phylum Chordata, 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 phylum Chordata. Okay, then we're up to class. And our class has to do with the fact that we have bodies that are covered with hair. Now, humans aren't as covered with hair as other members of this class, but bodies covered with hair and feed young via mammary glands. So the class is Mammalia, Mammalia, Mammalia. We are class Mammalia. Then we're order. The order that we have in common with other, many of which are arboreal or tree-dwelling creatures. We have opposing thumbs, and that order is primate, Primate. We're in the order primate. We're in the family Hominidae, hominid, Hominidae, Hominidae, Hominidae. And then we're in the genus Homo, just HOMO, and the species Sapiens, Sapiens. And when we say the name of a species, we include both the genus name and the species name. And I'll remind you what I said before. The first name in this case is actually more general, Homo, and the second name, Sapiens, is more specific to our species. And humans are unique in that they don't share the same genus with any other extant organism. So Homo sapiens are the only members of that genus that are extant or currently living. Every living thing is classified as belonging to each one of those taxa, from the least inclusive or most exclusive, which is species, to the most inclusive or least exclusive, however you want to look at it, domain. So domains are huge groups, and species are very, as you might get from the name, specific. Species is specific, only includes a very small group. Excuse me. Okay. And if you have to go back, that's fine. Okay. So first of all, we're going to talk about the five kingdom system. So this was really I guess the primary system of classification over the last many decades maybe. More recently, we've gone to what the next thing we'll talk about, which is a three domain system. But five kingdoms, organisms are placed in taxa or groupings according to what type of cells do they have. Are they prokaryotic or eukaryotic? Their level of organization. Are they single celled or are they multicellular? And then their mode of nutrition. Are they autotrophic or are they heterotrophic? And so each of these groups, so for example, if we said what kingdom of organisms is eukaryotic, multicellular, and heterotrophic, that is, has cells with a nucleus, has more than one cell working together as the organism, and then gets their food from the outside. Well, you might be able to figure out that would describe the kingdom Animalia. That's how we are, right? We have eukaryotic cells. We're made of multiple cells, and we are heterotrophic. We have to get our nutrients from outside. On the other hand, if we said, let's see, eukaryotic and multicellular and autotrophic, you might think of plants. They too have nucleated cells. They're made of multiple cells, but they're able to make their own food. They're autotrophic, so that would be plants. And so those are three key ideas that help us to identify which kingdom a particular organism fits into. And then you'd have single-celled organisms like bacteria and so on. Okay, then we have something called the three-domain system. And the three-domain system is based on the sequencing of ribosomal RNA. So you might think to yourself, well, that sounds like it's probably a bit more technical and maybe a bit more accurate, and you would be correct on that. So this is a way of classifying things that takes into account knowledge that we've only had for the past few decades. So it's based on their ribosomal RNA sequence. And includes three categories that are actually above kingdoms. So the kingdoms, plants and animals and fungi and so on, all are in the category of eukaryotes. So they would be under the arch of eukarya here in the three kingdom system, or three domain system, excuse me. So the three domains are bacteria and archaea and eukarya. And this is a question that will arise a few times. Archaea and eukarya seem to share a more recent common ancestor than they do to bacteria. Okay, so protists, fungi, plants, and animals are all in the domain eukarya. So when we were saying that we had a five kingdom system, four of those five kingdoms are actually in this one domain. Okay. And then the more primitive things are bacteria, or simpler, I should say, bacteria and archaea. As always, I'll remind you if I'm moving along more quickly than you can get this written down, go ahead and stop it. But I'm going to go on here. So now systems of naming and placing things in relation to other living things. There's the traditional system, which considers descent from common ancestors, and it produces what's called a phylogenetic tree. And that I'll show you in your book while you're writing. I'll find that and show you where you need to look. And then I have one that's up on here also, but it's page. Okay, it's kind of traditional systematics are in 2724 A, so it's on page 567. So it's this top one that you'd be looking at right there, page 567. So it shows that early reptiles gave rise then to mammals, and then turtles and snakes and lizards, and there's a branch that created, excuse me, crocodiles and birds. So that would be traditional. Okay, and in that case, birds are in their own class. But in some, okay, so here's maybe what that would look like. Let's see if I can. Okay, we have this series of how things fall into place. Um, Jawless fish, amphibians, mammals, turtles, lizards, snakes, crocodiles, birds. So we have all of these kind of subgroupings of uh, reptiles, and then the archosaurs divided into crocodiles and birds. You don't need to know a lot about this. Just understand that the difference is this is basically kind of features. These are divided sort of by features, you might say. Um, Whereas in cladistic systematics, it's based on molecular data. So it's based on the DNA and RNA as far as arranging them by how closely they're related. Um, they're placed in clades. Um, use the principle of parsimony, the pattern that requires the least amount of branching. So the principle of parsimony basically says the simplest explanation in most cases is the best explanation. So we're kind of striving for a simple, more straightforward explanation of how these things came to be. So in that system, um, it might look more like this. You might see only a slight difference here, but here we have uh, basically all of the reptiles, amphibians, then birds, then mammals. Okay, so cladistics is less subjective. So when we say objective or subjective, objective means there's really not much decision making when you look at it. If you look at a sequence of DNA, you can tell how many differences there are. And that's really quite objective, meaning you and I could both look at this set of these comparative sets of DNA and say, well, there looks like there are 15 differences in these sequences. And you count them and you say, yeah, there are 15 differences. So there's no real debate. Well, that's not a different sequence. Well, no, it's either a different amino acid sequence or it's not. And so that's objective. Subjective is to look at something and say, well, I think this animal's forelimb looks a lot like this animal's forelimb, and you say, well, no, I think this animal's forelimb looks a little bit more like this other animal's forelimb, and so we could debate that. It's not like there's black and white. This is alike and this isn't alike. But when we look at DNA and RNA, when we say that it's more objective, we can use the same set of rules and kind of come to the same conclusions. Subjective is it's open to our opinion or our background and our maybe even beliefs about what's more or less related. So cladistics is less subjective. Birds do not have their own category, but are placed with the crocodiles in what's called the Archosaur order of reptiles. Chimps and gorillas are included as hominids, so they're the same. Uh, they are actually in the same family. And then in traditional or classical, it includes chimps and gorillas with the orangutans as Pongidae. So it certainly has its differences. Okay, make sure that you get all the notes from this, and then that concludes our notes for the chapter. So you'll be ready to complete the book study guide, which is on Testmos.